ABC. I hope you guys had a great holiday season and a happy new year. It's coming to you from 2018 now. And, you know, I haven't had a ton of time over the holidays to think about records or make videos. I haven't even bought many records. But I wanted to do another Gimme 10 video now that I'm back with the larger collection. And I have access to, you know, a lot of my favorite records. So I thought I'd do a Gimme 10 video on the genre or style or subgenre, whatever you want to call it, of post-hardcore. Post-hardcore is a difficult genre to kind of explain, but it's a very interesting style of music. It's kind of the style of music that I grew up with. Most of the bands I'm going to talk about, the albums I'm going to talk about today, are albums that I grew up listening to, that were albums that were really important to shaping, you know, my taste in music. They were the albums that I identified with who I was in my generation, you know. In record collecting, we explore lots of different eras and generations and styles and, you know, subcultures of music. And this was kind of my subculture. This was like what I was a part of. So this is a genre that's really important to me. So I wanted to do a Gimme 10 video, so I'm going to show 10 records that were just really important to me in my journey through post-hardcore. And I tried to get, you know, I did one album per band. I tried to get a good survey of you know, the history of the genre while still doing my personal favorites. I wasn't able to include everything that I wanted to include. 10 records is so few in a genre that you love and cherish, so I'll do some honorable mentions or something. Some of you might be wondering what exactly post-hardcore is. It's a very widely defined genre. There's not really any hard and fast rules. The general definition I would give is post-hardcore music is music that takes the blueprint and the aesthetic of hardcore punk and kind of expands on it into uncharted territory. A lot of post-hardcore music can be quite progressive, although some of it isn't. A lot of post-hardcore music can use clean vocals. A lot of post-hardcore music can be much more virtuosic than traditional hardcore punk music. But just in general, overall, post-hardcore music, it takes the rubric and aesthetic and principles of hardcore punk or punk rock and just kind of does their own thing with them. And so that's why a lot of post-hardcore music sounds really different. So I'm just going to get into it and show some of these albums. I'll see in editing if I can put some clips of the bands in or not. I know YouTube sometimes has been not so cooperative with including musical examples. Even though, you know, clearly we're talking about criticism here, so definitely falls well under fair use, but YouTube doesn't care. So we'll see. But I'll just go through them. 10 records. Here we go. The first one I'm going to talk about is one of the earliest first landmark post-hardcore albums from the early 1990s. This is Fugazi's Repeater. Discord Records. This was an album that kind of started the genre off. It has, for those of you that don't know Fugazi, it came out of the ashes of two really important hardcore bands, Minor Threat, which featured Ian Mackay, and The Rites of Spring, which featured Guy Puciato. You know, this was kind of a foundational record for the genre. It showed that music could be aggressive and intense and have that punk aesthetic and still be slow and weird. You know, like especially like the last track on this album, Shut the Door, is such a creepy and unsettling and weird track that has all this intensity, but the intensity isn't in how fast they're playing. The intensity isn't in how crushing you know, the harmonics are. The intensity is in the emotion and in all these weird sounds they're able to make on their guitars. It's a really cool track on a stellar album, genre-defining album, Fugazi Repeater. Next is a album all the way from Europe, from Sweden. This is the final album of the hardcore punk band Refused. This is The Shape of Punk to Come. This is such a eclectic and intense album, just so well made. It flows so well. You know, most of the Refused catalog I would classify under hardcore punk. However, by this album, by their later albums, but definitely by this album, they had kind of crept into post-hardcore. You know, this was kind of a little bit underappreciated, I think, when it came out, because they broke up very shortly after. And it's really come, I think, to be fully appreciated is the masterpiece that it is. Of course, you know, the graphics and the aesthetics of the album cover and the title are a reference back to Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come. So, you know, this is an album that was kind of designed to be long-lasting, to be kind of iconic, and it is. Let's be real. It's an iconic album. Talking about energy, we have the final album from what is probably the best live band to ever exist, and that is At the Drive-In, Relationship of Command. This is a pretty legendary album. For those not familiar with At the Drive-In, they were a post-hardcore band from El Paso, Texas, that just had one of the most energetic and intense and crazy live shows I think you've ever seen. Just go on YouTube and look up old videos of them playing in like the late 90s or early 2000s. I mean, they were tearing the stage apart. So much energy, so sloppy, and yet so complex and spastic and just all over the place. You know, they played on like The Tonight Show, and they just destroyed the stage. You know, if you're not familiar with this band, you may be familiar with the bands that spawned out of the breakup of this band. So this band had a rough last couple of years despite putting out this amazing album, Relationship of Command. They were dealing with a lot of substance abuse issues and personal infighting in the band, and so they broke up, and half of the band went and formed the post-hardcore / alternative rock band Sparta, and the other half, the guitarist Omar Rodriguez Lopez and Cedric, formed the band the Mars Volta, which are probably more famous than At the Drive-In at this point. The Mars Volta are, you know, crazy, experimental, psychedelic, Pink Floyd-esque music. So, but yeah, At the Drive-In, one of the most legendary post-hardcore bands that ever existed. Genre-defining. Speaking of genre-defining, this is probably one of my favorite records of all time. This is Thursday's second album, Full Collapse.
Voices from another room. Happens all the time, but you lie in the sand. None leaves falling, counting down days to live. Drain the blood from this Valentine. We can rise from wings of
came out in 2001 as well. 2001 was a really good year for post-hardcore. You know, Thursday are one of my favorite bands, as you can see. And this was just such a intense, emotional album. This band came out in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and just kind of brought about emotion in music like it hadn't really been seen before. This record is pummeling, but it's also very unguarded emotionally, and it's very vulnerable. It's a very emotionally vulnerable record. The lyrics are kind of putting it all out there, putting this kind of alienation and deep-seated unrest out there. And for that reason, it's always, you know, it's always really connected to me, and it connected to a lot of people too. This is a record that a lot of people have strong feelings about. Going in a very different direction, you know, the Thursday album had a lot of singing on it. This album has very little singing on it. This is a crazy, spastic, intense, chaotic, anarchistic album by one of my favorite bands, the Blood Brothers. This is Burn Piano Island Burn. I mean, these albums are kind of all classics, so I should stop calling them classics, but I love bands with two singers. Bands with two singers do something for me when it's done well. It can be really cool. This band has two singers, one of which, you know, they're both kind of doing harsh vocals, one of which has this crazy high, like, falsetto scream, and the other has this kind of down low, like Jim Morrison-esque baritone, and they kind of play off each other. And while this is going, there's dissonant guitars and these crazy, like, cabaret keyboards. It's a really spastic album. It's a great example of the kind of, like, noise rock that was coming out of, like, the Pacific Northwest at the time, like Seattle and places like that. You know, these guys put out a ton of great albums, but I think this is the one that they really, like, broke into the mainstream with, and it's still my favorite, I think. Next, we have, you know, an album that may not be super important in the span of post-hardcore history. However, it's probably still my favorite album in existence. My favorite album, period. And that is The Sound of Animals Fighting, Tiger and the Duke. This came out in like 2004, and you know, I wasn't really listening to a lot of music that I was attached to at that point. I was still pretty young. I was in middle school. Maybe I was in 6th grade, 7th grade, that era, like 2004. I probably found this in 2005, so like 7th grade. And I walked into a Hot Topic one day, and sitting on the shelf was this, which is the original cover of this album. And you know, back then they had, you know, it was Hot Topic used to be a store that was very music centric. Like, if you were into punk music or heavy music or alternative music, you just go to Hot Topic and like talk about music with people, and listen to, they'd have demo stations where you could listen to like new music that had come out. So I would go and like try to discover new bands and discover like new types of music, because I was young and didn't really know what to listen to. And I found this, and I listened to this on the wall there, on the little headsets they had. And this was incredible. I had never really heard anything like this. It was aggressive, it was chaotic, it was thick, but it was also like really beautiful. Like, there's some really beautiful vocals on this, some really beautiful guitar lines. Out of any of these albums here, I would describe this album as the most progressive. It was very much a post-hardcore throwback to like classic prog rock, like Yes and stuff like that. Because, you know, the long songs, the long guitar solos, the experimental texture, like using different kinds of instruments. So I really fell in love with this album, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of other albums. And, you know, this band, The Sound of Animals Fighting, they were a supergroup that was mostly a studio band. They only toured twice, once in 2007 and once in 2014 when I finally got to see them. This was an interesting project. It was started by Rich Balling. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Rick Balling. It's spelled R-I-C-H, so I never know if it pronounces it Rich or Rick. But it was started by him, and he was a former trombonist for the band RX Bandits. So a lot of the members of RX Bandits play on this album and subsequent Sound of Animals Fighting albums. Particularly Matt Ombre, the guitarist from RX Bandits, plays most of the guitar stuff on here. And Chris T, whose last name I'm not going to try to pronounce, plays drums on this, and he's just an incredible drummer. It also has, this album has Randy Stromer from Finch, who is a big name in post-hardcore at the time. And it has a lot of vocalists. You know, Anthony Green from Circa Survive does most of the lead vocals on this, as well as Matthew Kelly from The Autumns, Keith Goodwin from Good Old War. I don't think Craig Owens from Chiodos is on this album. He's on the next album. But anyway, it's like they're like a post-hardcore supergroup. And it was weird that my entry to post-hardcore was this album and this band, because it's kind of an odd album and an odd band. But, so this is what the original album looks like with the original album art. This is kind of rare to find now. I think it actually sells for a bit of money on eBay, but I'm never, ever, ever getting rid of this. And then a couple years later, they remixed it, and the remix sounds a lot better. It's a lot fuller. Like, this was kind of done as an indie thing, and it sounds kind of tinny. They did the remix a while ago that was put out on Equal Vision, and that's the new art. And that's the art that the vinyl release uses. But what's really interesting is the remix sounds really good. And this is the art from the remix. The vinyl pressing that they put out uses the art from the remix, however, it uses the original mix, which doesn't quite sound as good. So I don't know. It's weird. They kind of threw this together, this vinyl release. You know, I love vinyl, but this is no better than the CDs, really. It's just, you know, in a bigger format, and it's nice to have one of your favorite albums on vinyl. I do actually kind of prefer the original artwork to this, though. It has a special place in my heart, probably because it was my first tattoo. So, yeah, this is a really special album to me. Next, we have another album that kind of got me into the genre really early, and this is Glassjaw's. I think this came out in 2004. Yeah, 2004 album, Worship and Tribute. Is their second album, second full-length record. Glassjaw from Long Island. They were really intense band. They definitely came from the tradition of like New York Northeastern straight edge hardcore, like that kind of thing. I think before these guys formed Glassjaw, they were in like another band that was like a Jewish hardcore straight edge band or something like that. I don't know the old history of this band that was before my time, but this is a great album, and it was kind of one of my big introductions to aggressive music. I think this was the first album that I really enjoyed that had screaming in it. I mean, it's kind of half of it has screaming, half of it has singing. It's kind of a mixture, which is another kind of hallmark of post-hardcore is the mixture of harsh vocals and clean vocals. I remember. Oh, you know, another mall story. Yeah, I remember being like 12 or 13 years old and walking into, of all places, a Spencer's Gifts, and a track from this album was playing on the store PA, and it was Pink Roses. And I was like, and I asked the store clerk, because it was like the morning and I was the only person in there, you know, who is this? Like, he actually went to the back because they had got like a pre-selected playlist back then, and went to the back, and it found out it was this band Glassjaw, and I wrote it down and went to the like Schuler Books and Music, or maybe it was a Barnes and Noble, and went and bought the CD, and it was it took a while to get used to. It was heavier than anything I'd listened to before. But I really grew to love it, and this is still one of my favorite albums ever. I should note, I almost forgot, I should talk about this. This is the Music on Vinyl pressing that came out just like a couple years ago. So on the original CD pressing of this, the CD case would open, and the CD was printed like the record, so the CD case would open, and that had the stylus and the arm would lift up, and you'd see that. And this vinyl pressing doesn't have that, but it's a really good sounding pressing. This is, you know, Music on Vinyl out of the Netherlands. Good sounding pressing, and I think the reason they didn't do the fancy cover is because for one of the older pressings, Warner Brothers did actually release it with the cover that was like you could see the record in it, and you can see it had this like plastic crinkly stuff on the outside, and you see the blank turntable platter because the record would sit here. And this is I think a white pressing. The problem is the plastic stuff they used on this clear cover bled into the record. Actually, I think, yeah, this is a Hot Topic exclusive. It bled into the record, and so it got gunk all over the record. So like side 2 of this pressing that I have is like basically unplayable, or maybe it's side 1, I forget. But it messed up the record, and from what I understand, this is a pretty common problem with this pressing of this record. So if you want to get this album, get the Music on Vinyl pressing, because it sounds great, and it doesn't have that problem. You know, the novelty is cute, it's nice, but I'd prefer to listen to the record. I think most people would too. Next is an album that I just played the shit out of in high school. I mean, I really played this album a ton, and I still do. It's one I always reach for. It is The Fall of Troy's 2007 album, Manipulator. This is such a good album from start to finish. You know, it was hard picking a Fall of Troy album to go into this list because I love the Fall of Troy so much. And like Doppelganger would have been a great pick because that's kind of the album that made them big. That's the album that most people know them for. That was the album that came out right before this. Phantom on the Horizon has some of my favorite work by them, but that's an EP, and I wanted to put a full-length album on here. So I think Manipulator is great. It's just so good from start to finish. It's the band at their most eclectic. You know, there's some pop elements in this record. There's some throwback, like there's a song that straight up sounds like a Weezer song on here. And then there's also that like crushing, there's also sections with crushing breakdowns and insane guitar solos. You know, the song Sledgehammer on here is just a behemoth of a song. It's so crushingly heavy and tuneful. And the last track, A Man, a Plan, a Canal, Panama, has some of the best guitar work I think this band's ever put out. Some of the most inventive riffs. You know, the Fall of Troy are very much a riff band. They'll write these awesome awesome riffs. So yeah, and this is one of the first vinyl pressings of this album that ever came out. It's the triple gatefolds. You know, they did 2 records at 45 RPM, but they did this really awesome huge fold-out gatefold with the artwork that is really cool, and from what I understand, pretty hard to get now. You know, they've done subsequent pressings of this album, but it's just been a regular gatefold. They haven't done the full artwork and everything. And I think my copy is the splatter version. Yeah, it's this like marbled splatter. It's a really cool color pressing that they did. This was done by, I think, Enjoy the Ride Records, which has done a lot of very interesting pressings of, you know, more independent music. So in terms of both like the music and, you know, having a really cool artistic piece, this is one of my favorite things in my collection. So we're getting down. We got 2 albums left. So I guess number 9. We're on number 9. Number 9 is Enter Shikari's 2007 full-length debut, Take to the Skies. Enter Shikari are kind of a weird band, and I hesitated to classify them as post-hardcore because they have a lot of metalcore elements in them. Like, I didn't include Horse the Band in this list because, you know, Horse the Band really are a little bit more of a metal band, even though they often get associated with post-hardcore. So I didn't include Horse the Band, even though I love them. And I almost didn't include Enter Shikari, but I think they're a little more in the post-hardcore, hardcore punk tradition. So I wanted to include this. This is probably the most electronic influenced band of anyone on here. Enter Shikari really paved the way for doing well done electronic programming in rock music and in hardcore music. And they've evolved a lot over the years. You know, every Enter Shikari album is really different. They sound like a very different band now from when they put out Take to the Skies in 2007. However, this album just captured... It was the snapshot of so much energy, and just this band kind of was a breath of fresh air into the post-hardcore genre that was kind of getting a little bit stale by 2007. So even listening back to this album now, this album is just fun. You know, it's not like their later albums. You know, the recent Enter Shikari albums are very serious and very political, and while there's great songs on them and great writing and fun songs, tone-wise, they're kind of serious because Enter Shikari is a conscious band and they talk about pressing matters and politics. Well, these guys were youngins in 2007, and this album has very little of that. It's just really fun. It's a really, really fun post-hardcore album. It's an album that, I mean, this is an album that you can get up and dance to. This is an album that's going to have you banging your head. It's just a fun, cool-sounding album that kind of carves out its own sound. Nothing sounds like this, and still nothing has really sounded like this. They didn't make a genre, they're just their own thing. So that's what I really love about Enter Shikari. Before I do number 10 on this list, I gotta briefly, there's some albums I just can't do this list without mentioning. So I'm gonna briefly just do a couple honorable mentions. I'm not gonna talk about them, I'm just gonna say them. Drive Like Jehu, Yank Crime, classic 90s post-hardcore album. La Dispute, Somewhere at the Bottom of the River. You know, this band did so much to revitalize post-hardcore. Dance Gavin Dance, their self-titled record from 2008 with Kurt Travis, one of my favorite vocalists. Chiodo's All's Well That Ends Well. Man, I was really into this band when I was little. Trophy Scars, Alphabets, one of the more out of left field picks, I think. Oh, this is such a good album, such an emotional album. And The Receiving End of Sirens, Between the Heart and the Synapse, some of the best singing in post-hardcore. Just amazing singing on this record. Okay, that was fast. Okay, the final album on this list is from a band called Fear Before the March of Flames. It is The Always Open Mouth. This is such a cool, weird album. You know, Fear Before the March of Flames started out as more of a hardcore, almost screamo-tinged band, and they just got weirder and weirder. And you know, the guitarist Adam Rupert, guitarist slash clean vocalist Adam Rupert on this record. I was hearing an interview when he was talking about this, and he was doing so many weird things. Like, apparently he just made a different tuning for every song, and he was doing things like he would put a red solo cup over his guitar amp microphone to and cut slits in it to give it like a weird hissing sound. There's so many cool songs on this album. It's so eerie. It's so unsettling. So some of the sonic textures they're able to create on this thing, I have no idea how they made this. It's well paced. It's well structured. The lyrics are awesome, and it has, you know, everything I want in a post-hardcore album. This is such a cool experimental record for the genre. So Fear Before the March of Flames, The Always Open Mouth. So that's 10 records. Took me longer than I expected, but it always does, because I care about these albums a lot. They mean a lot to me. What are some of your favorite post-hardcore albums? Is this your first introduction to the genre? I know for a lot of people in the VC who are maybe from a different generation to me, it probably is your introduction to post-hardcore. But some people my age are probably pretty familiar with some of these bands. So any favorites on this list? Any favorites that I left out? Any records I didn't talk about at all that you're saying, man, I should have talked about these? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for being great. Subscription counts continue to rise. Really great community of people. As always, cheers, VC.